It was the summer of 2016, and I had taken a solo trip through parts of Europe. I was 25 at the time, and after weeks of city hopping, I wanted something quieter, away from train stations, hostels, and crowds. I had planned a couple of days in Austria before heading further south. I found a small campsite online, tucked in the lower slopes of the Salzkammergut Mountains, about an hour's bus ride from Salzburg. The pictures showed a calm lake, dense pine forests, and flat areas where tents could be pitched. It looked perfect. The day I arrived was warm and clear. The small bus left me at a gravel pull-off with a wooden sign pointing toward the campsite. The path wound through tall grass, which swayed gently in the breeze, and the air smelled faintly of sap from the evergreens nearby. There was no reception building, just a faded board with a map of the area and a small payment box with instructions in German and English. The place seemed quiet. I spotted only 2 other tents off in the distance, barely visible through the trees. I picked a spot about 50 meters from the edge of the forest, close enough to the lake to hear water lapping against the shore, but far enough away to feel sheltered. The ground was soft with pine needles, and when I knelt to drive the stakes in, my hands came away smelling faintly of resin. I spent the rest of the afternoon exploring, following narrow trails that wound into the forest. The air inside the trees was cooler, almost damp, and every now and then I heard the distant sound of cowbells from the hills beyond. By the time I returned, the sun was dipping behind the ridge. The lake turned a deep shade of blue, and the air carried a sharper chill. I made a small dinner from the supplies in my pack, then sat watching the water darken, listening to the quiet. There was almost no wind. I remember thinking how rare it felt, completely alone but without feeling uneasy. At least not yet. I turned in just after 10. The inside of my tent felt warm from the day's heat, and I fell asleep quickly. At some point in the night, though, I woke up. The air was colder, and there was a faint sound outside, something like soft, steady footsteps on pine needles. I stayed still, listening. The steps would come for a few seconds, then stop, then start again. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, deer maybe, but the rhythm was wrong, too even, too deliberate. Eventually, the sound faded, and I drifted back to sleep. In the morning, the ground was wet from a light rain, and I noticed something strange near the edge of my tent. A single, partial footprint in the mud. It was bigger than mine, with the pattern of a heavy boot. I told myself it could have been left earlier, maybe by another camper passing through, though my stomach felt unsettled thinking about it. The day passed without incident. I took a long walk along the lake, climbed part of a trail up the slope, and returned to the campsite late in the afternoon. I didn't see anyone the whole time. Not the other campers, not anyone from the nearby village. As night came, the clouds thickened, and a light rain started again. The steady tapping on the tent made it harder to hear anything else outside, but I tried not to dwell on the noises from the night before. I must have been asleep for a few hours when I woke again, this time from something more distinct. It was the sound of wet leaves and needles being pressed underfoot, slow and heavy. Whoever or whatever it was, they were close. Then I saw it. A shadow moving against the faint light filtering through the tent fabric. Tall, broad shoulders. The shape passed slowly along one side of my tent, paused, then took a step back. My chest tightened so hard I barely breathed. I didn't move. I just stared at the fabric, watching as the shadow shifted again. The rain made it impossible to hear breathing or other noises, but the outline was clear enough that I knew it was a man. Minutes passed, or maybe just seconds. Finally, the shadow moved away toward the forest. I lay there frozen, every sound magnified in my ears. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I unzipped the tent and scanned the clearing. The rain had eased, leaving the ground damp and soft. That's when I saw them. Footprints in the mud, deep and clear. They came from the tree line, circled my tent twice, and then led back into the woods. I considered packing up immediately, but I told myself it could still be some hiker passing through, maybe curious about my camp. I forced myself to stay, though I kept my knife closer that day and barely left my tent except to eat. That night, the rain stopped completely. The air was colder, and the quiet was sharp. Every small sound carried farther. I tried to sleep early, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Around midnight, I heard it again. Slow steps, deliberate, coming from the forest. I kept still, every muscle tense. The sound stopped just outside my tent. I could hear breathing this time, heavy, steady. The fabric shifted slightly, like a hand had brushed against it. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then came the part that still makes my skin crawl. There was the sound of someone crouching down, their weight shifting onto their heels, right beside my tent. They didn't say anything, didn't move, just crouched there, breathing, for what felt like minutes. My hand was clenched around the knife in my sleeping bag, my mind running through every possibility. If I yelled, if I ran, if I stayed silent. Finally, the sound of slow, heavy steps moved away into the forest. I waited, listening until I couldn't hear anything else, then slowly sat up. I didn't sleep again that night. At dawn, I packed everything as quickly as I could, barely stopping to eat. I followed the path back toward the road, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. When I reached the gravel pull-off, I saw something that made my stomach knot even more. On the far side of the clearing, leaning against one of the pines, was a man. Tall, wearing a dark coat, boots caked in mud. He wasn't looking at me directly, just standing there, head slightly tilted, like he was pretending to watch something in the trees. I didn't slow down. I kept walking until I reached the bus stop, my pack heavy and my hands damp with sweat despite the cool air. The bus came after 20 long minutes. When it pulled away, I glanced back through the window. The clearing was empty. I never found out who he was or what he wanted. Maybe it was nothing, some wanderer from the village, curious about a lone camper. But I know what I heard those nights, the deliberate way he moved, the quiet crouch beside my tent. That wasn't curiosity. It felt like he was waiting for something or deciding something. And whatever it was, I'm glad I left before he made up his mind. I was 29 that summer in 2017 when I decided to take my dog, Scout, out for a weekend of camping in northern Wyoming. Scout was a 4-year-old mixed breed, medium-sized, all muscle and energy. I had been working long hours in the city and wanted some quiet, just me, him, and open land. I'd chosen a stretch of national forest, far from the designated campgrounds. I wanted to avoid the weekend crowds, so I picked a spot about a mile off an unpaved logging road, near a slow-moving creek. The air was dry but heavy with the smell of pine. There were no marked trails where I went, only faint signs of old footpaths and deer runs. The place felt untouched. I set up my small green tent in a clearing about 50 feet from the water. The sun was lowering behind the ridgeline when I finished staking the last corner. Scout sniffed every inch of the campsite, tail high, then flopped down in the grass to watch me unpack my gear. By the time darkness came, the temperature dropped sharply. The forest around us went still except for the occasional sound of water trickling over rocks. I cooked a small meal over the camp stove, split some with Scout, and then sat listening to the night. Far off, maybe a quarter mile, I thought I heard something moving in the brush. Too slow to be a deer, too heavy to be a raccoon. Scout's ears twitched, but he didn't get up, so I let it go. When I finally crawled into the tent, Scout settled in beside me, his body warm against my sleeping bag. The smell of the nylon mixed with the damp earth underneath. I left the rainfly partly unzipped to let air in, watching the black silhouette of the trees sway against the dim starlight. My thoughts drifted, but something kept me from fully sleeping. Scout's breathing was steady, but his head kept lifting, then resting again. It must have been around midnight when he suddenly stiffened. His body went rigid, head up, ears forward. I couldn't hear anything at first, only my own heartbeat speeding up. Then I caught it. A faint crunch of footsteps on dry needles, slow, deliberate, coming from the direction of the creek. They weren't heavy like boots, but not as light as a small animal. The sound stopped, then started again, closer. I reached for my flashlight without unzipping the sleeping bag, trying to make no noise. Scout let out a low growl, barely more than a vibration in his chest. I switched on the light and aimed it through the tent mesh toward the sound. Nothing moved, just the pale trunks of trees and the darkness between them. But the footsteps had stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but the quiet rush of water and my own breathing. Then I heard another noise, this time from the opposite side of camp. It was faint, like something brushing against a tree trunk. My stomach tightened. It felt like there were 2 points of movement, maybe more. I stayed still, listening, until my arms started to ache from holding the flashlight. Then I heard a new sound, metal tapping. Just one short click, like a rock hitting the side of a shovel. It was so out of place in the middle of the forest that my skin prickled instantly. Scout shifted, his claws digging slightly into the ground, his gaze fixed on the dark. I didn't want to make a noise, but I also didn't want to be blind. I unzipped the sleeping bag and slid out as quietly as I could. I grabbed the small hatchet I kept near the tent door. I crouched low, listening. Minutes passed, maybe more. The night seemed to stretch, pressing in. Then, from the direction of the logging road, I caught a flicker of light, weak, yellow, bobbing slowly. A flashlight. Whoever it was wasn't moving fast, and they weren't using it to search. It was pointed down like they didn't want to draw attention. Every instinct told me to pack up and leave, but moving through the forest in the dark with only a small flashlight would be just as risky. I decided to wait to see if they passed by. The light disappeared for a few minutes, then reappeared, this time lower, as if whoever held it had crouched or was behind something. I couldn't hear the creak anymore over the pounding in my ears. Scout's growl deepened, and I put my hand on his back to steady him. That's when I heard it again, the faint crunch of footsteps, now coming from behind us, between the tent and the road. Whoever it was, they weren't alone. I knew staying in the tent was the worst choice now. I quickly unclipped Scout's leash from my backpack, looped it onto his collar, and held the hatchet tight in my other hand. I stuffed the flashlight into my jacket pocket, using my hand to shield its beam so it didn't give away our position. We slipped into the trees, moving in the opposite direction of the lights. I kept low, choosing ground that was soft enough to muffle our steps. Scout stayed close, alert but silent. The forest was uneven here, with fallen logs and patches of thick brush. I navigated by memory and the sound of the creek until I was far enough to turn upstream. I could still hear faint movements behind us, spread out, like more than one person walking slowly, stopping often. They weren't calling out, weren't talking, just searching. It took over an hour to work our way back toward the logging road, moving wide around where I'd seen the light earlier. My truck was parked about a quarter mile down the road from the trail I'd taken in. The night air felt colder here, the trees less dense. I could see the pale strip of gravel through the trunks. That's when Scout froze again. Ahead, maybe 30 yards up the road, I saw another dim light. This one steady, not moving. It was parked low, near the ground, like someone sitting with a flashlight. My stomach dropped. My truck was in that direction. We waited, crouched in the brush. My mind kept counting options, none good. I could hear the faint hum of insects, the slow pulse of my own breath, and somewhere far back in the trees, another faint tap of metal. I decided to move deeper into the forest and put more distance between us and the road. I'd rather wait until morning than risk walking into whatever was ahead. By the time the eastern sky started to lighten, we were both exhausted. Scout was limping slightly from stepping on something sharp in the dark. I kept us moving until I recognized a slope I'd crossed on the way in. From there, I cut back to the road from a different angle, emerging about 100 yards behind my truck. I stayed in the trees, scanning for movement. The road was empty, no lights, no figures. I jogged the last stretch, unlocked the truck, and got Scout inside. My hands shook as I turned the key and drove, gravel spitting under the tires. Only when I hit the main paved road did I let myself slow down. I glanced in the rearview mirror, just empty road and forest. But the image of those slow, deliberate lights moving through the trees stayed with me the whole drive home. I never figured out who they were or what they were doing that night. There was no reason for anyone to be that deep in the forest, moving without speaking, circling a campsite. The thought of how close they'd been, how they'd split up to surround the area, made my skin crawl for weeks afterward. Scout slept in the back seat the whole way, his head on his paws, but every time I shifted, his ears twitched like he was still listening for those same footsteps. I haven't camped that far off trail since, and I've never gone out there alone again. It was late summer of 1998, and I had taken a week off from my job in Ohio to drive out west and camp in the mountains of Wyoming. I was 29 then, still young enough to feel invincible, but old enough to crave quiet over nightlife. I wanted to be away from people, far from phones, noise, and the endless hum of the city. I had planned the trip carefully. Maps spread on my kitchen table for days, marking a small, remote section of the Bighorn National Forest where there were no official campgrounds, just miles of pine, creeks, and unpaved forest roads. I left my truck parked on a rough dirt pull-off and hiked about 3 miles in with my pack and gear. The air smelled sharp with pine and dust. The trail, if you could call it that, was faint, just a narrow line of flattened grass and dirt through knee-high brush. I found a flat spot near a small creek that had just enough room for my tent and a fire pit. No signs of other campers. No beer cans, no burnt logs, just clean ground. I pitched the tent and spent the late afternoon gathering dry wood. The silence felt heavier than I expected. Even in the deep woods back home, you still heard the distant sound of a car or a plane overhead every so often. Here, there was nothing except the faint trickle of the creek and the occasional creak of trees in the breeze. By the time the sun dipped low, the temperature was already dropping. I had my fire going, cooking a small pan of beans, the smell drifting into the night air. I ate slow, staring into the flames. The darkness beyond the firelight was total. The stars above were so thick they looked like spilled salt. That first night passed quietly. I woke once to the sound of something moving through the brush near the creek, but the footfalls were light and slow, probably a deer. The second day, I hiked further upriver, following the creek through dense pines and over patches of smooth granite. Around midday, I found an old, collapsed log cabin. It was just 4 walls left standing, the roof long gone. Moss clung to the wood, and rusted tin lay half buried in the grass. Inside, there was a broken chair, the legs splintered and gray with rot. I stayed only a few minutes. It felt strange being there, like I was stepping into something I wasn't supposed to see. By the time I made it back to camp, the sun was already leaning low. I started the fire earlier than the night before. The quiet was deeper now. No birds calling, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, just stillness. I ate, read a few pages from the paperback I'd brought, and turned in early. It was maybe 2 hours later when I woke up. My tent was cold. my sleeping bag pulled tight around my shoulders. At first, I thought it was the wind that had woken me, but then I realized there was no wind. The night was still. Then I heard it, footsteps. Not the slow, irregular steps of a deer or elk. These were steady. 2 legs. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. They were coming from the direction of the creek, moving closer. My heart picked up. I stayed still, breathing slow, my ears straining. The steps came to a stop just outside the tent, maybe 10 feet away. There was no light, just darkness pressing against the thin nylon. I couldn't see anything. I thought about calling out, but something in me said not to. The footsteps started again, moving slowly around the tent. I could hear the grass brushing against whatever it was. Once it stopped right at the backside, just inches from where my head was. I held my breath. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes. Then, without warning, the steps moved away, deliberate, fading back toward the creek until I couldn't hear them anymore. I didn't sleep much after that. Every small sound outside made me tense. The next morning, the ground around my tent looked different. The grass was pressed down in a clear arc, like someone had walked around it during the night. I crouched low, scanning for shoe prints. There were faint impressions, too large to be from me, too wide apart for a deer. I spent most of the day debating whether to pack up and leave. It would take hours to hike out and then drive back to the nearest town. I told myself it was probably a hunter passing through, maybe scouting. I decided to stay one more night, but I kept my gear ready to pack in a hurry. That evening, I built my fire higher, the flames leaping against the dark. I didn't wander far from camp. Every shadow felt closer than it should. I sat with my back against a log, my flashlight beside me, listening. It was just past midnight when I heard the sound again. This time it didn't come from the creek. It came from uphill through the trees. Slow steps, a pause, another step. I could hear twigs snapping under the weight. The sound circled wider this time, staying just beyond the reach of my firelight. I kept the flashlight aimed toward the sound, but I couldn't catch a shape, just black trees shifting in the dark. Then the steps stopped. The forest went dead quiet. I sat there for nearly an hour, every muscle tight, waiting, but nothing came closer. When morning broke, I made my decision. I packed everything in less than 20 minutes. I didn't eat. I didn't even stop to refill my water. The hike back felt longer than it should have. My ears tuned to every noise behind me. Several times I thought I heard faint footsteps on the trail behind me. But when I stopped, there was only the whisper of pine needles in the breeze. When I finally reached the truck, I loaded my gear fast, my hands shaking. I didn't look back as I drove down that narrow dirt road. By the time I hit the main highway, the sun was high, and the open sky made me feel a little less on edge. But even now, years later, I still think about those nights out there, about how whoever or whatever was walking around my camp wasn't just passing by. They were watching, moving slow, making sure I knew they were there. I never went back to that part of Wyoming, and I never camp alone that far from people anymore. The rain had been falling since before sunset, a steady drumming on the tarp above my tent that had grown heavier as the night went on. I was deep in the Amazon, far from any town, camping on a patch of muddy ground I had cleared earlier that day. The air was heavy and damp, thick with the smell of wet soil, rotting leaves, and the faint tang of smoke from the small fire I had built before the rain killed it. I was 32 at the time, traveling alone, moving downriver by canoe and setting up camp each night wherever I could find a flat space. It was 2018, late in the wet season, and every day the river swelled higher. The rain made the jungle sound alive in a strange, overwhelming way. It didn't just fall. It crashed through leaves, ran in streams down tree trunks, and splashed in the puddles forming all around me. Beneath that constant noise, I could still hear the insects, a high, buzzing chorus that never stopped, and somewhere in the distance, the low, throaty croak of frogs. My tent felt like a thin bubble in the middle of something massive and restless. I had eaten a cold meal earlier, a few mouthfuls of rice and beans from a tin, and I was lying on my sleeping mat trying to ignore the wet chill that had crept into my clothes. My shirt clung to me, and the humidity made it impossible for anything to dry. Every time I shifted, my elbow brushed the damp nylon of the tent wall and left a wet mark on my skin. My boots, sitting just outside the tent flap, were probably filling with rainwater by now. I'd have to dump them out in the morning. I wasn't exactly afraid yet, just uncomfortable, restless, and aware of how far I was from help if anything went wrong. I had been alone in the jungle before, but there's something about a night like that, black sky, constant rain, no moonlight, that makes you feel more isolated than usual. The forest felt endless. It was sometime past midnight when I heard it, different from the rain, different from the frogs, different from the night. A soft, irregular rustling from somewhere beyond the tent. Not the wind. The rain drowned out most small sounds, so for me to hear something through it meant it was close. My first thought was an animal, maybe a tapir or a capybara passing by. I held still, listening. The sound came again, slower this time. It was not the splash of hooves in water or the brush of a body through low plants. It was lighter, almost careful. My mind went to jaguars next. I'd been told they sometimes stalk camps, drawn by the smell of food. My fire had gone out hours ago. There was nothing to keep an animal away. The rustling stopped, and the only sound was the rain. I waited, counting heartbeats, not sure if I should unzip the tent to look. The darkness outside would be complete. My headlamp was buried in my pack, and even if I grabbed it, the beam would only cut through a few meters of the downpour. Then I heard it again, but closer. This time it was a faint squelch, like a foot pressing into wet soil. Not paws, feet. I froze. My breath felt louder than it should. The jungle is not empty. There are hunters, fishermen, people who live far from the cities, and sometimes, just sometimes, you come across someone who does not want to be seen. I had heard stories from locals upriver. Not all of them were about criminals. Sometimes it was just a stranger who didn't speak your language, someone who might see you as a threat or as prey. The steps were slow. They came from the direction of the trees, moving toward my tent. The rain disguised their distance, but I could tell they were within 20 or 30 feet. I reached for my machete. It was lying on the ground beside my mat, and held it in my lap. My hands were wet with sweat despite the coolness in the air. I sat there like that for a long time, just listening. Sometimes the steps stopped altogether, and I would think maybe I had imagined them. Then a shift of weight, another soft squelch, and I knew they were still there. The worst part was the not knowing. An animal would have moved on by now. Whoever or whatever was out there was lingering, and that meant they were aware of me. The rain didn't let up, but eventually, I heard the sound change. The footsteps began to circle, slow and wide. They kept a distance at first, maybe 15 meters, moving through the undergrowth with deliberate pauses. I could picture someone scanning the camp, looking for movement, for light, for any sign I was awake. My tent was dark. I sat perfectly still. My back ached from holding the same position, but I didn't move. After a while, minutes, maybe longer, the steps came closer again. I could hear water dripping from leaves onto something solid, maybe their shoulders or head. I could almost feel the weight of them watching me. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the steps receded. They didn't run, just walked slowly back into the trees, the sound blending with the rain until I could no longer tell if they were still there. I stayed awake the rest of the night, machete in hand, eyes fixed on the faint outline of the tent walls. Every creak of a branch, every shift of the wind, made me think they had come back. My legs cramped from sitting upright, but I didn't lie down. When the first gray light came through the fabric, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The rain had eased to a drizzle. The ground was churned with fresh footprints, bare human feet. They circled my tent, stopping at different points, and then led back into the trees. I followed them a short distance until they vanished into the undergrowth. That was enough for me. I packed quickly, shoving wet gear into my bag, not caring about order or weight. My canoe was tied to a tree at the riverbank, half filled with rainwater. I bailed it out with my pot, pushed off, and let the current take me downstream. I didn't look back. Even hours later, when the rain finally stopped and the sun began to burn through the mist, I kept glancing at the tree line. The jungle was just as it had been, green, endless, and loud with life. But I knew someone had been there, close enough to reach out and touch my tent, and they hadn't made a sound until they wanted me to hear them. It was the summer of 2014, and my friend Ryan and I decided to take a short camping trip to a quiet spot we'd found the year before. It was in the hills just outside of Boise, Idaho, about an hour's drive from the nearest store, and far enough from any main road that you couldn't hear cars at night. We had been there once before, and we liked how secluded it was. The only sounds were the wind moving through the pine trees and the occasional call of some bird you couldn't see. We planned to stay for 2 nights. We both brought our own tents, food, and enough gear to keep us comfortable. The place wasn't an official campground. It was just a clearing in the trees we had found on a hike months earlier. We parked the car at a dirt pull-off, then carried our gear in about half a mile. There was no trail, but the way was easy enough to remember from last time. By the time we got there, the sun was already lowering behind the tree line. We set up camp quickly, tents facing opposite sides of the clearing, with a small fire pit in the middle. The air was warm, the kind of dry heat that stays in the ground even after the sun sets. The forest felt calm, but it was the kind of calm where you were always aware of how far you were from other people. That first night was uneventful. We ate, watched the fire burn down, and eventually went to our tents. I remember lying there listening to the distant rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. In the middle of the night, I woke up once, not from a sound, but from how quiet it was. Sometimes silence feels louder than noise. I fell back asleep after a while. The next day we hiked around the area, explored a few ridges, and collected more firewood for the night. By evening, we were back at camp. That night, the temperature dropped quickly. We sat close to the fire, talking less than the night before, just watching the flames. I noticed Ryan kept glancing into the tree line. I thought it was just nerves, but I felt it too. Something was different. I couldn't hear any of the small forest noises that usually never stop. No crickets, no birds, not even the wind. We stayed up later than planned, maybe because neither of us felt like lying in the dark just yet. Eventually, though, the fire burned low and we went to our tents. I had trouble falling asleep. My body was tired from hiking, but my mind kept tuning in to every little sound outside. The fabric of the tent rustled when I shifted, and that seemed loud enough to give away my position. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around me and tried to slow my breathing. At some point, I must have dozed off, but I woke up again when I heard footsteps. They weren't rushing or clumsy. They were slow, deliberate, the kind of steps where whoever's making them doesn't want to be noticed. My first thought was that it was Ryan, maybe going to take a leak, but the steps were too far from his tent. They were on my side of the clearing, moving just outside the reach of the moonlight. I stayed perfectly still, barely even breathing. The steps stopped for a while, then started again, this time moving toward the fire pit. There was no fire left, only cold ash, but I heard the faint scrape of a boot on a rock. I wanted to call out, to ask if it was Ryan, but something about it didn't feel right. If it had been him, he would have had a light, or he would have walked directly from his tent. I thought about unzipping the tent and shining my flashlight, but that would mean making noise and showing exactly where I was. Instead, I just lay there, gripping the handle of the small knife I always kept next to my sleeping bag. The footsteps moved again, slower now, as if whoever it was looking around carefully. Then they stopped completely. For what felt like forever, I heard nothing. I couldn't tell if the person was still standing there, or if they had left. My heart was pounding so hard that I started worrying it was loud enough to hear outside the tent. Finally, I heard movement again, but it wasn't walking. It was a faint crunch, like someone kneeling on dry leaves. This sound was right at the edge of my tent, near my feet. I froze. My mind was racing. There was nothing valuable out here, nothing to steal. Whoever it was wasn't here for things. I kept the knife in my hand and didn't move. After what must have been a full minute, I heard the steps again, moving away this time into the woods. They didn't go fast, but eventually the sound faded into nothing. I stayed awake for hours after that, listening, trying to make sense of it. I thought about unzipping the tent to check if Ryan was awake, but I didn't want to risk making any sound. By the time the first light came through the trees, my sleeping bag was damp with sweat. I got out of the tent and saw Ryan already standing there. He looked like he hadn't slept either. His face was pale and he was scanning the tree line. I didn't need to ask if he'd heard something. We packed up quickly. Neither of us talked much as we took down the tents and stuffed our gear into our packs. On the way back to the car, we both kept looking behind us, expecting to see someone. We didn't. The woods were empty again, like nothing had happened. When we got to the car, I finally saw it, fresh footprints in the dirt pull off. They weren't ours. They were larger than my boots, and there were two sets, both coming from the direction of the woods, not the trail we had taken in. They stopped right near the driver's side door of my car, then turned back toward the forest. We didn't stay to inspect them. We just got in and drove. The road was rough, but I didn't slow down until we hit the pavement. That was the last time I went camping in a place without other people around. I don't know who was out there that night or what they wanted, but I know for sure that they knew we were there, and they came close enough to touch our tents. That's not something you forget. I camped on a farm once, and I still don't like to think about it too much. It was late summer 2014 in southern Ohio. I was 25 back then, and I'd been trying to take more solo trips to get away from the noise, as I used to call it. A coworker of mine had mentioned an old family farm they no longer really used for crops, just for storing equipment and letting the fields go mostly wild. He said I could pitch my tent there for a weekend if I wanted. The place was about an hour outside of the nearest town. You had to take a narrow, cracked road that curved through patches of corn and soybean fields, then a long dirt lane that rattled my car until I finally saw a faded red barn and an empty farmhouse with boarded-up windows. Nobody lived there anymore. The house leaned slightly to one side, the paint flaking like sunburned skin. The barn doors hung crooked on their hinges. The fields around it were a mix of overgrown grass, weeds, and a few fenced-off sections where rusting farm tools and machinery sat half-buried in the earth. You could tell this place had been abandoned for years. I parked near the barn and grabbed my gear. It was late afternoon, still warm, but there was a strange stillness in the air. The wind barely moved the tall grass. I didn't hear birds, just the faint buzz of crickets and the occasional creak of old wood from the barn. I walked a little ways behind the barn to set up camp. There was a small clearing at the edge of a line of trees, maybe 50 yards from the main field. It gave me some shade and cover, but I could still see the barn in the distance. I set up my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and gathered a pile of sticks for a small fire. The smell of dry grass and dirt was heavy in the air. When the sun went down, the farm turned pitch black. No streetlights, no distant glow from houses, just darkness swallowing everything. My little fire barely lit a small circle around me. I cooked a can of chili on my camp stove, ate slowly, and tried to enjoy the quiet. But there was something about the silence here that didn't feel peaceful. It felt hollow, like the place was holding its breath. Around 9 p.m., I decided to walk out into the field a bit with my flashlight. The grass brushed my knees, and the beam lit up small patches ahead of me. I kept glancing back at my tent to make sure I could still see it. The barn looked different in the flashlight beam. Darker, more massive, almost leaning toward me. When I got about halfway to it, I stopped. I didn't hear the crickets anymore. I stood still, thinking maybe I just imagined the difference. But no, the sound had completely cut off. My ears felt strange, like when you walk into a soundproof room. Then I noticed it, a faint, rhythmic clinking sound. Metal on metal, slow and uneven. It was coming from inside the barn. I told myself it could just be something loose blowing in the wind. But there was no wind. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, just listening. The clinking would stop for a few beats, then start again. I decided I didn't need to know what it was. I turned and walked back to my tent, trying to keep my pace calm, even though my skin felt tight and cold. I got in the tent, zipped it shut, and sat there with my flashlight off. I could still faintly hear the clinking, and the longer I listened, the more I realized it wasn't random. It had a strange, uneven pattern, like someone was dragging a chain and letting it drop every few steps. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the grass. They were slow, crunching through the dry stems, and they were coming from the direction of the barn. My tent was thin enough that I could hear everything clearly. The steps stopped about 10 feet from where I was lying. I didn't move. My sleeping bag suddenly felt suffocating. The sound stayed there for what felt like minutes. No footsteps, no breathing, just the weight of someone's presence. Then I heard the faint scrape of something metallic, like a shovel blade dragging lightly against the dirt. It circled my tent slowly, pausing every few steps. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. When it stopped directly behind my tent, I thought I might actually pass out. I didn't have a weapon, just a small pocket knife, and I knew if I unzipped the tent, whoever or whatever was out there would hear me. Then the sound began to move away, back toward the barn. I lay there for hours, barely breathing, until I finally saw the faint light of dawn through the fabric of my tent. When I got out in the morning, the grass around my tent was bent down in a thin trail, like someone had walked in circles around it. I followed the trail a few steps, and it led straight toward the barn. That was when I saw something I hadn't noticed yesterday. Behind the barn, there was a deep trench in the dirt, maybe 3 feet wide, running for about 20 yards. At the end of it was a large, rusted metal drum lying on its side. The top had been pried open, and the inside was pitch black. I didn't look inside. I packed my gear as fast as I could. My hands were shaking, and I kept glancing at the barn, half expecting to see someone standing there watching me. By the time I got to my car, the morning air still had that dead quiet. No birds, no insects, just the crunch of my shoes on gravel. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main highway. I never went back, and I never asked my coworker about the farm. I don't want to know who was out there that night or what they were doing. All I know is that whoever it was, they didn't want me there. And I think if I'd stepped out of that tent, I wouldn't have made it off that farm. I had decided to take a few days off from work and spend some time outdoors. It was early autumn of 2017, and the air was starting to turn crisp. I packed up my old camping gear, The same tent I'd been using since college, a sleeping bag that had seen better days, and a small propane stove. My plan was to head out alone to a quiet camping spot in the northern woods of Montana, far from any popular trails. I'd been there once before with a group of friends years back, but this time I wanted the stillness of solitude. I parked my car at a small gravel clearing off a dirt road and hiked in with my pack. The hike was about 4 miles through tall pine trees, with dry leaves crunching under my boots. The forest was quiet except for the occasional creak of branches and the faint rustle of something small moving through the undergrowth. The deeper I went, the more the sounds of the world faded away. By late afternoon, I reached the clearing I remembered. It was a flat piece of ground near a narrow stream, with enough space for my tent and a fire pit someone had built years before. I set my pack down and got to work. The air was cool, but I was sweating from the hike, and every time the wind blew, I could feel it chill the damp skin on my neck. I pitched my tent facing the stream, making sure the entrance was downhill so rain wouldn't flood it. I collected enough wood to keep a fire going for a few hours, then cooked a small meal. The sun dipped lower, throwing long shadows across the trees, and the orange light made the whole place look like it had been painted in warm colors. Once darkness came, the forest turned into a completely different world. My fire crackled softly, and I could hear the constant trickle of the stream nearby. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, and something, maybe a rabbit, darted through the bushes. I wasn't afraid. I'd camped alone before, and the noises of the night had always been part of the experience. Around 9 p.m., the fire had burned down to glowing coals. I sat on a small folding stool, sipping hot tea from my metal cup. That's when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It was faint at first, just a quick snapping of twigs somewhere in the dark behind me. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon, but the steps were heavier than that. They weren't constant either. A few steps, then silence. Then another step closer. I turned my head slowly, but beyond the edge of the firelight, the forest was nothing but blackness. The sound stopped. I could hear my own breathing, louder than I wanted it to be. I waited, eyes fixed on the darkness, but nothing moved. Trying to shake it off, I tossed another small log onto the fire, and the flames brightened the clearing again. I didn't see anything unusual. After a few minutes, I climbed into my tent, zipped it shut, and lay inside my sleeping bag with a flashlight in hand. The sound of the stream helped me relax a little, but my ears kept picking up small noises, tiny snaps, faint crunches. Around midnight, I woke to the feeling that something was outside my tent. I didn't hear it at first. I felt it, a sort of pressure in the air, like I wasn't alone. Then came a long, slow dragging sound in the dirt just outside. I held my breath, every muscle in my body locked. The dragging stopped. I turned off my flashlight and listened. It was dead quiet for a full minute. Then there was a single, sharp crack of a stick breaking. I gripped my small camping knife in one hand. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but eventually, exhaustion took over and I drifted in and out of uneasy sleep. Every time I woke, I would listen for movement, and sometimes I thought I heard it, slow, deliberate steps somewhere just out of sight. By early morning, the sun hadn't quite risen yet, but the sky was pale gray. I stepped out of my tent, my breath fogging in the cold air. The ground around my campsite told a story I didn't want to think about. There were footprints in the dirt, human ones, big enough that they definitely weren't mine. They circled the tent, went down toward the stream, then came back again. The strangest thing was how quiet it had been. Whoever it was had moved slowly, carefully, like they didn't want to wake me. I packed up as fast as I could, shoving my sleeping bag into my pack without even rolling it. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get the tent poles down. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the trees, watching. When I finally hoisted my pack onto my shoulders, I noticed something else. A large, flat rock near the fire pit had been turned over. Underneath it was a small pile of cigarette butts, all old and weathered. That meant someone had camped here before, maybe more than once, maybe recently. The hike back to my car felt much longer than the hike in. Every few minutes, I stopped to listen, thinking I heard footsteps behind me, but it was always nothing. My heart didn't stop pounding until I saw the glint of my car through the trees. When I reached the gravel clearing, my stomach dropped. There was a fresh footprint in the dirt by my driver's door, and it wasn't mine. I unlocked the car fast, tossed my gear in the back, and started the engine without even taking off my pack. I drove the rough dirt road until I hit pavement, and only then did I pull over. I sat there for a long time trying to calm down. I kept replaying the night in my head, the footsteps, the dragging sound, the footprints in the morning. None of it made sense. Why circle my tent? Why stay quiet? Whoever it was had the chance to speak up, to make their presence known, but they didn't. They just watched. That was the last time I went camping alone. Even now, years later, when I hear a stick snap in the woods, I feel that same icy weight in my chest. I never found out who it was, and I guess I never will. But I know one thing. Someone was out there with me that night, and they weren't lost, and they weren't passing through. They were there for me. It was the summer of 2016, and for some reason I still can't fully explain, I decided to camp alone in the old Stonefield graveyard just outside a small rural town in northern England. I had been camping for years, mostly in forests or by lakes, but I'd never tried anything like this. The graveyard sat at the end of a long, narrow lane that wound between overgrown hedges and dry stone walls. It hadn't been used for decades. At least that's what I'd read online. The newer burials were in a modern cemetery 2 miles away. This place was nothing more than crumbling headstones, moss, and leaning trees that had been left to grow wild. I'd arrived late in the afternoon, around 6 p.m. The air was warm and still, but the sky had a heavy, dull look as if rain might come later. My rucksack felt heavier than usual, stuffed with a small tent, sleeping bag, food, and a torch. The gate to the graveyard was rusted but not locked. It squealed loudly when I pushed it open, a sound that echoed in the stillness and immediately made me feel exposed. The grass was knee-high in places, dotted with white wildflowers and thick patches of nettles. The stones were worn smooth by time, many of them tilting or half sunken into the soil. I picked a spot near the back corner, close to a large yew tree whose branches hung low enough to offer some cover. The ground there was uneven, full of shallow dips where the earth had settled over old graves, but I found a relatively flat patch just big enough for my small tent. Setting it up took longer than it should have. The grass was thick and tangled, and my pegs kept hitting buried stones. Sweat ran down my back as I worked, and all the while I kept glancing around, feeling like I was being watched even though the place was deserted. Once the tent was up, I sat on my rucksack and ate a sandwich, watching the light fade. By 8 p.m., the sun was low and casting long shadows through the crooked gravestones. The air grew cooler, and the first signs of wind began to rustle the tree branches overhead. Somewhere far off, I could hear the low rumble of thunder. I walked around for a bit before it got fully dark, weaving between graves, reading the faded names and dates. The oldest I could make out was from the late 1700s, the letters almost gone. Some graves had stone borders that had cracked and shifted. Others were nothing more than a lump in the ground, the marker long gone. The yew trees seemed to soak up the remaining light, their trunks gnarled and roots twisting through the soil like veins. By the time I returned to the tent, the clouds had thickened and the air smelled like rain. I zipped myself inside, laid out my sleeping bag, and tried to relax. Outside, the wind picked up, making the tent walls shiver and pop. Leaves scraped across the ground. The rain began not long after, soft at first, then heavier, pattering on the tent and dripping through the trees. I lay there in the dark, listening. Normally, the sound of rain calms me, but here it felt different. The noise seemed to mask other sounds, making me strain my ears. I thought I heard something moving through the grass nearby, a slow rustling like someone dragging their feet. I told myself it was probably a fox or a badger, maybe even a hedgehog nosing through the weeds. The movement stopped. The rain kept falling. My breathing felt too loud inside the tent. Then, from somewhere to my left, I heard the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Not quick, not heavy, just slow and deliberate, like someone taking careful steps along the old path. My skin prickled instantly. I froze completely, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps drew closer, stopping and starting as if whoever it was kept pausing to listen. I knew there was no reason for anyone to be in this graveyard at night. The road was far off, and the lane leading here was barely passable by car. My mind began running through possibilities. Teenagers messing around, someone from the village out walking, maybe even a drunk who'd stumbled in. But none of those ideas made me feel any better. The steps reached a point just beyond my tent, no more than a few meters away. I could hear the wet grass swish with each movement. Then they stopped completely. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might be audible. The rain filled the silence. I didn't dare look out. I stayed still, gripping the torch but keeping it off. After what felt like minutes, the steps began again, but this time they moved around the side of the tent, slow and steady. I could hear the soft squelch of mud underfoot, the faint brushing of fabric against long grass. They passed behind me, then moved toward the yew tree, and then nothing. I waited, counting the seconds, trying to convince myself they'd left. But I couldn't hear any footsteps moving away, no gate opening, just the rain and the wind. Eventually, after maybe 20 minutes, I unzipped the tent just enough to peer out. My torch beam cut through the wet air, lighting up the gravestones. Nothing moved. The grass glistened, the trees swayed, but there was no sign of anyone. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound kept me alert. The creak of branches, the hiss of rain, the occasional plop of water from leaves onto the tent. My body ached from lying tense for hours. When the sky began to lighten in the early morning, I packed up quickly, shoving everything into my rucksack without bothering to eat. I made my way toward the gate, glancing back often. The ground was slippery, and the grass soaked my trousers. Just before I left, I noticed something in the mud near the yew tree. Footprints, large, boot-shaped, the tread still clear despite the rain. They led from the path around my tent and back toward the far wall of the graveyard, but they didn't go to the gate. They stopped abruptly at the wall, as if whoever made them had just stood there for a while. I followed them with my eyes. The wall was about 5 feet high, topped with uneven stones. Beyond it was a thick tangle of brambles and trees. No obvious path. I stood there in the drizzle, feeling the hair on my neck rise again. Whoever had been there last night hadn't left the way they came in. I didn't stick around to think about it. I walked quickly down the lane, the cold morning air biting at my face. My boots squelched with each step. I didn't look back at the gate. When I reached my car, parked where the lane met the main road, I sat inside for a long moment before starting the engine. My hands were shaking. I told myself it could have been nothing, just someone curious, maybe cutting through the area. But deep down, I knew there was no reason for anyone to be wandering around an abandoned graveyard in the middle of a stormy night. It's been years since that night, but I still remember the sound of those slow, deliberate footsteps and the way they circled me in the dark. I've camped many places since, but I've never gone near Stonefield again. Some places you just don't go back to, not because of ghosts or old stories, but because of the people who might be out there watching when you think you're alone. I was 24 in the summer of 2016, working long hours at a warehouse in Indiana. By the time July came, I'd saved enough for a week off. I wanted to get away from the noise, the forklifts, the stale air, and the constant smell of cardboard and diesel. I packed up my old Ford Ranger and drove south toward Kentucky, where I knew there were patches of forest big enough to feel like I was hundreds of miles from anyone. I'd been camping alone before, but never for more than a night. This time, I planned to stay 3 days. I pulled into a small gravel parking lot at the edge of the Daniel Boone National Forest. There was a faded wooden sign, a couple of bullet holes in it, warning about bears and ticks. No ranger station, no campground map, just a dirt trail heading into the trees. That was exactly what I wanted. No other people, no RVs humming in the background, no shouting kids. Just me, the forest, and quiet. The air was humid but still, the kind of stillness where you can hear your own breathing. I slung my backpack over my shoulder and started walking. I wanted to set up camp far from the trail, deep enough that no one wandering by would spot me. After about 2 hours of hiking, I found a small clearing surrounded by dense oak and hickory. A downed tree on one side acted like a natural barrier, and I could see the faint shimmer of a creek through the trees on the other. Perfect. I pitched my small tent, hung my food in a dry bag from a high branch, and gathered enough wood for a small fire. The sun sank and the forest changed. Birds quieted down. The buzzing of insects grew sharper, almost louder. Somewhere in the distance, a single tree frog started up, then another, until it felt like the whole place was breathing in its own rhythm. That first night was uneventful. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the creak and the occasional snap of a branch in the distance. Normal forest sounds. Animals moving around, wind shifting through the leaves. The second day was hot. I spent the morning fishing the creek, catching a few small trout. I cooked them over the fire, bones crackling in the heat. I spent the afternoon exploring further into the woods. I saw deer tracks, a raccoon near the creek, even a hawk swooping low over the treetops. By late afternoon, I was tired and ready to just sit by the fire until dark. That's when I noticed something. About 30 yards from my tent, in a patch of dirt near the base of an old maple, there were footprints. Not animal prints, boot prints. The ground was soft from rain 2 days earlier, and these looked fresh. The edges were sharp, the tread clear. Someone had been here. The odd thing was, the prints didn't come from the direction of the trail. They seemed to appear from the woods themselves, curve slightly around my camp, and vanish into thicker brush. I told myself it could be a hunter or another camper passing through. Still, I didn't like it. I decided to be more alert. I ate dinner with my back against the log so I could see in all directions. As the sun dropped, the woods seemed to grow darker faster than the night before, like the trees were closing in a little earlier than they should. That night, I woke up twice. The first time was around midnight. I thought I heard something soft, not twigs snapping, but the sound of weight shifting on damp ground. I held my breath, listening. Nothing, just the creak again. The second time was closer to 3 a.m., when I woke to what sounded like a slow, steady crunch of leaves. Not an animal darting around, but something heavier, deliberate. It lasted maybe 15 seconds, then stopped completely. By morning, I was uneasy. I thought about packing up and heading back, but it felt stupid to ruin the trip over some footprints. I told myself it was nothing, maybe even my own prints from before that I hadn't noticed. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I went about my day as planned, but I stayed closer to camp. Around noon, while gathering more wood, I noticed something else. Behind a thick clump of brush about 20 yards from my tent, There was a small piece of fabric caught on a branch. It was dark, maybe black or navy, torn from clothing. When I pulled it free, I saw that it was part of a shirt sleeve, frayed edges smelling faintly of sweat. That was enough to put me on edge. I kept glancing toward the trees, scanning for movement. The forest suddenly felt bigger, deeper, like there were more places for someone to be hiding than I could ever check. That evening, I built my fire higher than usual. The crackle of the flames made me feel a little safer. I kept my knife close and my flashlight in my pocket. I ate quickly, barely tasting my food, just wanting to get inside the tent and zip it tight. It was around midnight when I woke again, not to sound this time, but to the faint glow of my fire still burning outside. I could see it through the thin fabric of the tent. And then I realized something. I hadn't left it that high. The flames were higher than they should have been. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and peeked out. My stomach went tight. Someone had stacked more wood on my fire. Fresh wood, still damp at the ends. I scanned the darkness beyond the firelight, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. The trees were still, no movement, but I knew someone had been here. Recently, I waited for what felt like hours, sitting in the tent with my knife in my hand, staring at the dim outline of the fire through the fabric. No footsteps, no voices, no movement, just that lingering fact in my head. I hadn't added that wood. When dawn finally broke, I didn't waste a second. I packed my gear fast, shoving everything into my backpack without folding or sorting. I didn't even eat breakfast. The whole hike back, I kept glancing behind me, convinced I'd see someone standing there, just far enough back to keep pace but not close enough to see clearly. I didn't see anyone. The gravel lot was empty when I reached it. My truck was untouched. But as I tossed my pack into the bed and got in, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. On the passenger side door handle, smeared faintly into the dust, was a print. Not a fingerprint, but the shape of a palm. I drove out of there without looking back. I didn't stop until I was 2 towns over, parked in a gas station lot, drinking burnt coffee just to have something warm in my hands. I haven't camped alone since. I still think about those footprints, the shirt sleeve, the fire. Whoever was out there never tried to speak, never came into the light, never made their presence fully known. But they wanted me to know they were there, and that was worse than anything else. I had been hunting alone for a few years, and I had gotten used to the quiet. It was November 2011, just outside the small town of Red Hill, Montana. I was 32 then, used to the cold, and stubborn enough to think I could handle a 3-day trip on my own. The plan was to set up camp near a ridge I knew, track some elk, and head back before the next storm rolled in. The weather was dry but sharp, with that kind of air that burned your lungs if you breathed too deep. I parked my old Chevy at the edge of an old logging road, threw my pack over my shoulder, and hiked in about 3 miles. The spot I picked to set up camp was a small clearing by a slow, shallow stream. The ground there was covered in frost, the kind that made your boots crunch. I pitched my tent facing east so the morning light would hit it first thing. I set my rifle down beside a small pile of firewood I'd gathered and boiled some water for coffee before heading out to scout the ridge. The woods were dead quiet. No wind, no birds, not even the usual cracking of branches in the distance. Just the sound of my boots against frozen ground and the occasional click of the safety on my rifle when I adjusted it. I didn't think much of it at first. Animals get scarce when the temperature drops that low. I climbed higher, scanning for tracks, but the only fresh ones I saw were a few deer hoof prints cutting across a narrow game trail. By late afternoon, I circled back to camp with nothing to show for it. The sun was already dipping behind the ridge, and that heavy, bluish shadow started swallowing the forest. I lit a small fire, ate a can of beans, and sat listening to the tiny pops from the wood burning. The silence was so complete that every sound, the hiss of my breath, the crack of ice melting near the stream, seemed too loud. Around 8 p.m., I killed the fire and crawled into my sleeping bag. The cold seeped through the ground into my bones, even with the thick mat beneath me. I lay there for a while, staring at the thin nylon above me, waiting for sleep. That's when I heard it. A single, deliberate crunch of snow just beyond the tent. I froze. I thought maybe it was a deer wandering too close, but then there was another step and it was heavier. It wasn't the quick, nervous shuffle of an animal. It was slow, careful, like someone was trying not to be noticed. My rifle was next to me, and I gripped it tight, staying perfectly still. The steps stopped. I could hear my own heartbeat thumping in my ears. After a minute, I unzipped the tent just a few inches and peeked out. The clearing looked empty. My breath was visible in the air, hanging there like smoke. I stayed like that, staring, until my eyes watered from the cold. Then, I zipped the tent back up and told myself it was nothing. But I didn't sleep much. The next morning, there were footprints. Not boot prints, not hooves, but the kind of shape you'd see from someone wearing thick winter boots. They came from the trees, circled the tent, and then went back the way they came. I stood there for a long time, looking at them. The snow was hard-packed, so I couldn't tell how fresh they were, but they hadn't been there yesterday afternoon. I'd been all over this clearing, and I'd have noticed them. I thought about packing up and leaving, but part of me wanted to believe it was just some hiker who wandered too far. So I stayed. I told myself I'd just keep the rifle close and stay alert. The day went by slow. I hunted the ridge again, saw nothing, and came back before sunset. I skipped the fire that night. Didn't want to draw attention. I ate cold jerky inside the tent, listening. The forest stayed quiet until about 1 a.m. That's when I heard it again. The steps were farther this time, moving around the edge of the clearing. Then they stopped. For maybe an hour, nothing. Then, out of nowhere, a snapping sound like a branch breaking under weight came from just past the stream. I waited, rifle in hand, the safety off. My fingers ached from how hard I was gripping it. My mouth was dry, and I could feel sweat under my thermal shirt even though the air inside the tent was near freezing. When the first bit of light broke the next morning, I unzipped the tent and looked around. More footprints. Same size, same shape. They hadn't come closer than 20 feet this time, but they circled wide and disappeared into the trees on the north side. That was enough for me. I packed up camp in under 10 minutes. Every sound I made seemed too loud. The tearing of duct tape from my tent poles, the clink of my stove going into my pack. I kept looking over my shoulder. The woods still looked empty, but the feeling of being watched was like a weight pressing against my back. The hike back to the truck was the longest 3 miles of my life. Every so often, I'd stop and listen. Once, about halfway, I thought I heard something matching my pace off in the trees. When I stopped, it stopped. When I moved again, I didn't hear it anymore. When I finally reached the logging road, my truck was right where I left it, covered in a thin sheet of frost. I tossed my pack in the bed and got in, locking the doors before I even started the engine. My breath was shaking as much as my hands. I drove the whole way back to Red Hill without stopping. When I pulled into my driveway, the relief was so strong I just sat there for a while, engine running, staring at the frost melting off the windshield. Later that day, I called a friend who hunted the same area. I didn't tell him everything, just that I'd seen some strange tracks and felt like someone was out there at night. He told me I wasn't the first person to say that. A few guys over the years had come back early, saying they thought someone was moving around their camps while they slept. No one ever caught anyone, and nothing was ever taken. Just footsteps. I never went back to that ridge. I still hunt, but only with friends now. and I always keep a light on in camp at night. The sound of snow crunching under slow, deliberate steps has stayed in my head ever since, and the thought that whoever or whatever was out there didn't want to hurt me right then is the only reason I made it home. But I can't stop thinking, if I'd stayed one more night, maybe they would have decided otherwise. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to take a week off work and head out camping alone. I'd been working late shifts for months, feeling drained and restless, and I needed the quiet. I picked a spot deep in the northern Michigan woods, near a small lake I'd fished at years ago. I remembered it being empty, no trails leading in except for a rough dirt path. I packed light but enough to last 4 days: tent, sleeping bag, food, small stove, and a .22 rifle I sometimes brought for plinking cans. I left early in the morning, the sun just breaking over the horizon, the air cool and smelling faintly of pine. By mid-afternoon, I reached the dirt turnoff. The road in was narrower than I remembered. Branches scraped against my truck as I crawled forward, and a layer of wet leaves from a recent rain clung to the tires. I parked near a small clearing a few hundred feet from the lake. No signs of anyone else, no tire marks, no old fire pits, nothing. Just the sound of water lapping and the occasional thump of a pine cone hitting the ground. I set up my tent close to the tree-line, not far from where the ground sloped toward the water. The lake was calm, almost too still, with patches of green algae drifting lazily on the surface. Across the water, thick forest rose up, unbroken in any direction. I boiled water, made some instant noodles, and sat by the edge watching the sun dip lower. It was so quiet that when a fish jumped, it startled me. That first night, I woke around 2 a.m. to a sound I couldn't place. It was faint, somewhere far off in the woods, but distinct. A slow crunch of leaves, pause, then another. It wasn't the scatter of a raccoon or the quick steps of a deer. It sounded heavier. I lay still, eyes open in the darkness of my tent, my heart starting to pound. The sound came and went for maybe 10 minutes, then nothing. I told myself it was probably a deer anyway, rolled over, and eventually drifted back off. The next day passed without much happening. I spent the morning fishing, caught a small bass, and cooked it for lunch. I wandered along the shore, finding old beer cans rusted into the dirt, maybe from years ago. But there was something strange. Small piles of stones, each one neatly stacked, spaced along the tree line about 20 or 30 feet apart. At first I thought maybe kids had done it, but they were too precise. Not natural, but not obvious why they'd be there. I brushed it off and headed back. That night it rained, hard. The sound on my tent was constant, drowning out everything else. Sometime after midnight I woke again. This time it wasn't footsteps, it was breathing. I couldn't tell if it was real or just the sound of rain warping in my head, but it felt close, heavy, almost like someone was just outside the tent wall. I stayed still, every muscle tense. The rain made it impossible to hear well. A minute passed, then 2. I finally worked up the nerve to unzip the tent just enough to peek out with my flashlight. The beam caught nothing but sheets of rain and the dark shapes of trees. I closed it back up and sat awake until the sky started to lighten. The third day, I started feeling uneasy. I'd been looking forward to the solitude, but now it felt like the air itself was watching me. While walking up the dirt path to collect some dry wood, I saw boot prints. Not mine, these were bigger, wider, and they were fresh. The rain had cleared the ground last night, and these were sharp-edged, pressed into the mud. They came from deeper in the woods and stopped near the edge of my camp, then turned back. I felt my stomach twist. I kept busy, making food, tending the fire, but I kept glancing into the woods. By evening, I'd decided I was going to leave the next morning. The feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. I loaded some gear into the truck early, just to make it easier. The sun set behind thick clouds, leaving the forest dim even before full dark. Around midnight, I woke again. This time, I didn't hear anything at first, just the faint ripple of water from the lake. I lay still, listening. Then came a long, slow drag sound, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. It was faint, but it was there, somewhere between the tent and the tree-line. My throat went dry. I reached for the rifle beside me, keeping quiet. The dragging stopped. Silence. Then, footsteps again, deliberate, slow, circling. I held my breath. Suddenly, the soft crunching shifted to quick steps, moving away. I waited, heart pounding so loud it felt like it filled the tent. After a few minutes, I heard a splash from the lake. Not like a fish, too loud, too heavy. I stayed awake until the faintest hint of dawn. When I stepped outside, the first thing I saw was the wet outline of a boot print not 10 feet from my tent. The drag mark was real, cutting through the wet leaves toward the lake. My stomach turned cold. I walked to the water's edge and saw a patch where the weeds were flattened, leading into the shallows. I didn't waste time. I packed what was left, barely eating, constantly looking over my shoulder. The whole forest felt like it was holding its breath. As I drove down the dirt road, I glanced in the mirror more than at the road ahead. It wasn't until I hit the main highway that I let out the tension I'd been holding for 3 days. I never reported it. What would I even say? Someone walked around my tent and dragged something into the lake? No proof, no faces, nothing. But sometimes, when I'm trying to sleep, I hear that same slow, dragging sound in my head, and I wonder not just what they were carrying, but if they were planning on taking me instead. It was late September 2015 when I decided to camp alone in the hills of northern Wales. The place wasn't too far from civilization, but far enough that when the sun went down, the only things you could hear were the wind moving through the grass and the distant sound of a stream. The forecast had warned about possible rain, but I didn't think much of it. I had camped in rain before. This time, I wanted the peace and stillness that came with being away from people. I parked my car a short walk down a muddy trail, carried my gear up a slope, and found a flat patch between 2 tall bushes where the wind wouldn't hit me directly. By the time I set up my tent, the clouds had already started gathering. They weren't the light, fluffy ones that pass harmlessly overhead, but heavy, swollen shapes that moved low across the sky. I could smell the rain before it started, that damp, earthy scent mixing with the faint sweetness of the nearby grass. I boiled some water for instant noodles, ate quietly, and watched the light fade. The sky turned from pale gray to a darker slate, and soon I could barely see the outline of the ridge in the distance. The first drops of rain came soft and spaced apart, tapping gently on the tent's fabric. I zipped the tent shut and lay back, listening to the rhythm. It was calming at first, but it didn't stay gentle for long. Within half an hour, the rain was a constant roar. The wind had picked up, pushing against the side of the tent so hard it made the poles tremble. I could hear the bushes outside thrashing, their leaves whipping together in the gusts. Water began to pool around the edges of the tent floor. I shifted my sleeping bag away from the damp corner, annoyed but not yet worried. Then, through the sound of the rain, I caught something different, a faint crunch, like a boot pressing into wet soil. I froze. It was so subtle I wondered if I'd imagined it. I listened harder, holding my breath. The rain hammered on, masking almost every other sound. But then it came again, a little closer this time. I tried to convince myself it was probably a branch falling or an animal moving through the grass. There were sheep in these hills, sometimes deer, but there was something about the rhythm of the steps, slow, deliberate, that didn't feel like an animal. My tent walls were thin, and with the rain hitting so hard, I could barely see shapes outside unless they were close. I sat up quietly, my sleeping bag rustling under me. My headlamp was within reach, but I didn't want to turn it on yet. I wanted my eyes to stay adjusted to the dark. Another step. This time it was unmistakable. The ground was soft from the rain, and I could hear the wet squelch of mud under weight. It was coming from the slope I had climbed earlier to get here. The steps stopped for a moment, and I could feel my own heartbeat in my ears. The rain masked most sounds, but every so often there was a break in the wind where I could pick out smaller noises. I thought I heard something metallic, like a faint clink of metal on metal, but it was gone before I could be sure. I considered unzipping the tent and calling out, but the thought of doing that made my stomach tighten. If it was just an animal, calling out might scare it off. But if it wasn't, drawing attention to myself in the dark didn't feel smart. I decided to wait and listen. Minutes passed, though it felt longer. Then I heard the steps again, circling now. Whoever or whatever it was had moved lower, to the other side of the bushes that shielded my tent from the wind. The shape of the sound told me they were close, maybe less than 30 feet away. The rain kept falling hard, but I could now make out a new noise. A slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled through wet grass. Every hair on my arms stood on end. My breathing became shallow without me realizing. I didn't move, but my fingers had curled into tight fists inside my sleeping bag. It was pitch dark outside except for the occasional pale flash of lightning, which lit up the hills in quick bursts. One flash came, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw a figure through the wet fabric of the tent. Just a vague outline, tall, standing still, facing in my direction. When the light vanished, the shape was gone, swallowed by the darkness again. The dragging sound stopped, replaced again by slow steps, this time moving away. My instinct told me to stay still and silent, so I didn't follow it with my eyes. I just listened as the sound faded into the rain. I thought it might be over, but then the steps returned, faster this time, splashing in the mud, heading straight for the tent. My whole body tensed. Without thinking, I reached for my pack where I kept a small folding knife. My hand stayed there, gripping it tight inside the pocket. The footsteps came right up to the bushes, then stopped dead. The pause felt endless. I couldn't hear breathing, couldn't hear movement, just the rain hammering down. Then, just as sudden as it had stopped, the sound of footsteps moved away again, back toward the slope. I stayed awake for hours after that, listening to every sound outside. The rain finally began to ease around 3 a.m., and the wind died down. My body ached from staying tense so long, and I kept imagining shapes moving outside. By the time daylight finally came, the ground was soaked and slippery. I stepped outside the tent slowly, my boots sinking slightly into the mud. The bushes dripped cold water onto my shoulders as I pushed through them to the slope. There, in the wet earth, were prints. Not the hoof marks of deer or the small tracks of a fox. These were heavy, deep impressions from boots, the tread clear even in the mud. They led up the slope toward the trail I had walked in on, and mixed among them were long, shallow grooves in the soil, as if something had been dragged alongside. I followed the prints for maybe 20 yards before they vanished into the mess of grass and puddles. My stomach felt tight the whole time, and I knew I wasn't going to spend another night out there. I packed up as fast as I could, my hands cold and stiff from the wet air. Back at the car, I noticed something that made my chest tighten. On the rear passenger side door, just above the handle, there was a streak of mud, a hand-shaped smear, for long fingers clearly visible. It hadn't been there when I left the car yesterday. I didn't wait around to think about it. I drove out of those hills without looking back, the rain starting to fall again in the mirror. Even now, years later, the sound of boots in mud still makes my skin crawl. It was the summer of 2014, and I had taken a week off work to get away from the noise of the city. I was 31 at the time, still living alone in a cramped flat in Birmingham, and I had started craving the kind of quiet you can only find in the countryside. I picked a small campsite in the Peak District, near a village called Idaho. I'd been there once before, years ago, but this time I chose a more secluded pitch, away from the main path, closer to the edge of a small wooded area. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun still high enough to light the rolling hills in soft gold. The site was sparsely populated, maybe 3 other tents scattered across the open field. I set up mine on a slight rise, the grass short but uneven, and the trees forming a sort of dark wall at my back. It felt safe enough, though I noticed there wasn't much between the campsite and the woods except a thin wire fence, barely waist-high, with a single gap near my tent where the ground dipped. After pitching the tent and setting up my small camping stove, I walked down to a nearby stream to refill my bottles. The air was cooler there, damp from the water, and I remember seeing a lone heron standing still in the shallows. By the time I got back, the sky had shifted to that soft evening blue, and the breeze had dropped to nothing. It was quiet, almost too quiet. I ate a simple meal of beans and bread, then sat on the folding chair outside my tent. I watched the light fade over the hills, the edges of the landscape blurring into shadow. The only sounds were distant sheep and the occasional rustle from the woods behind me. When the darkness settled fully, I climbed into my sleeping bag and switched off my torch. I don't know what time I first woke up. It must have been sometime after midnight, because the air was cold enough to sting my nose, and there was condensation on the inside of the tent. At first, I thought it was just the wind that had pulled me from sleep, a faint, steady sound of movement outside. But then I realized there was no wind. The trees weren't shifting. The fabric of the tent wasn't fluttering. The sound was more deliberate, like footsteps on damp grass. I stayed still, my eyes adjusting to the faint outline of the tent above me. The steps were slow, uneven, and they stopped for several seconds at a time, as if whoever or whatever was making them kept pausing to listen. My heart started to race, and I felt my hands getting clammy inside the sleeping bag. I told myself it could be another camper returning from the toilet block, but the sound wasn't coming from the direction of the facilities. It was coming from the trees, from the gap in the fence behind my tent. The steps came closer until they were just outside the thin nylon wall at my back. I could hear the grass being crushed under weight and the faint sound of breathing. It wasn't heavy or labored, but it was close enough that I could tell it was human. I didn't move. I kept my breathing shallow, praying they would just keep walking past. But they didn't. Whoever it was stood there for what felt like a full minute, silent except for the faint shift of their feet. Then there was the sound of something brushing against the side of the tent. Not a full touch, more like the back of a hand dragging lightly across the fabric. I felt a wave of heat flood my face despite the cold. My mind was racing through options. Should I unzip the tent and confront them, or just stay silent and hope they left? I didn't have any kind of weapon, not even a heavy torch. My penknife was buried somewhere in my rucksack, and I wasn't about to start rummaging for it in the dark. Then, slowly, the steps began again, moving away from the tent. I waited until the sound faded completely before I dared to move. I slid out of the sleeping bag, pulled on my boots, and unzipped the tent just enough to look out. The campsite was almost pitch black except for a dim orange glow in the far distance from someone else's dying campfire. My breath clouded in front of me, and I strained my eyes toward the woods. That's when I saw him. He was standing just inside the tree-line, partly hidden by the shadows. Tall, thin, wearing what looked like an old dark coat that reached his knees. I couldn't make out his face. It was either in shadow or turned slightly away, but I could see the pale skin of his hands hanging loosely at his sides. He wasn't moving, just standing there, facing my direction. I froze. My legs felt like they were locking into place. I kept staring at him, waiting for him to turn or walk away, but he stayed exactly where he was. The cold air seemed heavier, pressing against my ears. After maybe 10 seconds, though it felt much longer, he stepped backward into the darkness until I couldn't see him anymore. I stood there for another minute, barely breathing, before zipping the tent shut again. Sleep was out of the question. I sat upright inside the tent, torch in my lap, listening to every faint sound outside. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but the idea of stepping out into the dark again made my stomach twist. I stayed like that until the first faint light of morning began to touch the hills. The relief I felt when the sky turned pale was like a physical thing. I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the dew-wet grass, scanning the edge of the woods. There was no sign of anyone. Still, when I walked toward the gap in the fence, I noticed the grass there was flattened, as if someone had stood in the same spot for a while. I followed the trail into the first few feet of the woods, and sure enough, there were more crushed patches, leading deeper in. I didn't go far. I didn't want to know how far the tracks went. I packed up quickly, barely stopping to eat. By the time the sun was fully over the hills, I was on the road heading back toward Birmingham. Even as I drove, I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see someone walking along the verge. It's been years since that night, but the image of him, standing just inside the trees, still and silent, has never left my mind. I don't know if he was a local, a drifter, or someone with far worse intentions. All I know is that he wasn't there by accident. He had walked through the woods in the middle of the night, straight to the back of my tent. And for reasons I'll never understand, he had just stood there, listening to me breathe. I haven't camped alone since. I went camping alone in northern Arizona in October of 1998. I was 22 at the time, fresh out of college, and working a job that I hated in Phoenix. I'd been telling myself for months that I needed a break from the city noise, the constant hum of traffic, the neon glow outside my apartment window. I wanted cold air, the smell of pine, and nights where the stars didn't have to fight through pollution to be seen. I drove north for hours, letting the road rise slowly into the high country until the dry desert scrub turned into dense forest. By the time I reached the Coconino National Forest, the sun was low and the temperature had dropped almost 20 degrees from what it had been in the city. I had chosen a place far from the main campground, an old service road marked on an outdated map I found at a used bookstore. It hadn't been maintained in years, and weeds grew through the cracks in the dirt path. I parked my beat-up 91 Bronco in a small clearing surrounded by tall ponderosa pines. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath. There was no wind, no far-off traffic, just that stillness you get in deep woods where every little sound stands out. I pitched my tent about 30 yards from the truck, close enough that I could get to it quickly if I needed to, but far enough to feel truly out there. The ground was covered in a thick layer of needles that muffled my footsteps. I gathered firewood, the sound of dry branches snapping echoing softly between the trees. By the time I had a fire going, the last of the sunlight was gone. The sky was a hard black, stars scattered like salt, and the moon was just a thin slice. I cooked a simple dinner, canned chili heated over the fire, and sat there eating with my gloves still on. It was peaceful. I kept catching myself staring into the dark between the trees, not because I was afraid, but because there was something hypnotic about the way the firelight stopped abruptly, leaving the rest of the forest in shadow. Around 10, I banked the fire down and crawled into my tent. The cold hit me quick without the flames. I zipped the sleeping bag tight around my shoulders, pulled my wool hat down over my ears, and lay listening to the quiet. Somewhere far off, I heard an owl, then nothing. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I woke to the sound of footsteps. They weren't heavy, just soft crunches on the bed of pine needles, but deliberate. The kind of sound that makes your brain snap into full awareness before you even open your eyes. I lay still, breathing slow, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. A deer, maybe, or an elk. I'd seen plenty earlier in the drive, but the steps were too careful. They paused now and then started again, circling. I could hear them moving around the tent, slow, steady. My first thought was that it was another person, maybe someone camping nearby who had stumbled on my sight. But I hadn't seen a single car on the road in, and I was miles from the main campground. Then I heard it just outside the tent, maybe 5 feet away. A sound like someone trying to imitate a person's voice, but failing. It was a sharp, awkward mimic of what could have been a cough or a short laugh, but it was wrong. It was the way a recording sounds when the tape is warped. The hair on my neck stood up so fast it almost hurt. I stayed still, barely breathing. The footsteps started again, moving toward the truck. I could hear them in the dirt now instead of the needles. Something brushed against the side of the tent, making the nylon ripple. I sat up slowly, my hand on the flashlight. I thought about unzipping the tent, but the idea of whatever was out there seeing me first made my stomach turn. The footsteps moved away again, into the trees. I could hear them for a long time before they faded completely. Eventually, I let myself lie back down, but sleep didn't come. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke again to the faintest sound of my name. Not loud, not whispered, just spoken. The exact tone my brother uses when he's trying to get my attention from across a room. But my brother was hundreds of miles away. The voice came from outside the tent. Then, a second later, from farther away. Then, from the opposite side. It wasn't just moving, it was shifting location too quickly, as if whoever was making it could glide silently between spots. That was when I decided I wasn't waiting until morning. I grabbed my boots, my jacket, my sleeping bag, and shoved everything into the truck as fast as I could. I didn't even bother taking down the tent. As I slammed the Bronco's door, my headlights lit up the tree line ahead. For a second, I saw something tall, thin, hunched slightly forward, skin stretched tight and pale in the high beams. Its arms were too long, hands almost reaching its knees. The head tilted in a way no person's neck could manage. It turned away before my mind could process all of it, disappearing between the trees in 2 long strides. I didn't stay to watch. I threw the truck in gear and tore down the service road, the suspension groaning at every rut and rock. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway, where I pulled over, hands shaking so badly I could barely keep them on the wheel. The whole drive home, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something running along the side of the road, keeping pace with me. The next day, I went back for the tent. It was exactly where I'd left it. Nothing inside had been touched, but around the campsite, in the bed of pine needles, I could see tracks. Not boot prints, not paw prints, just long, bare impressions, each one too wide for a human foot, spaced far apart like the stride of something that barely needed to try when it walked. I didn't camp alone again for years after that. Even now, when I do, I make sure there's another vehicle nearby, someone else I can hear breathing in their own tent when I wake up in the dark. Because sometimes, when the wind dies and the forest goes still, I think I can hear that same wrong laugh, far off in the trees, getting closer.